Good morning. I am Laura Savage, Senior Program Manager supporting career and equity advancement at ICMA. Kicking off our inaugural Equity Summit is Jim Malloy, ICMA President and City Manager of Lexington, Massachusetts. President Malloy, thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. I'm Jim Malloy, Town Manager of Lexington, Massachusetts, and currently serving as ICMA President. Welcome to Moving the Needle, Advancing Racial Equity in Local Government, the first virtual equity-focused learning event presented by ICMA. Over 400 local government and equity leaders are attending the two-day summit, an event complete with 2 keynotes, over 20 speakers, and a dozen sessions. 4 members of ICMA's Equity Officer cohort will host 4 conversations and connection huddles, which is space held for you to continue the conversation and network with each other. Whether you are a Chief Equity Officer, a seasoned manager, or entering the profession as a student, a fellow, or any point along your local government career, we hope today you will be inspired to strengthen ideas and institutions and explore topics of equity and accountability. We hope you acquire tools and skill-building ideas for driving a more inclusive and equitable culture throughout your organizations and communities. The Equity Officer cohort, consisting of 15 equity leaders who support the diverse ICMA-recognized local governments, have given their time and expertise and shared their professional and personal experiences to plan this exciting event. ICMA has focused for years on the diversity, equity, and inclusion and concepts that are built into our Code of Ethics and Declaration of Ideals. However, last June, after the murder of George Floyd, the ICMA board came together to issue a statement on systemic racism. It wasn't easy to draft because our board is a diverse group that reflects our diverse membership. And like our membership, they are all in different places and spaces, which made it a difficult conversation. We all wanted to condemn what happened to George Floyd and what has occurred systemically to marginalized communities in the US and around the world for years. Yet some felt very strongly that we also needed to stand up for the very many good police officers that work for all of us as local government managers. As a board, we also believed that we needed to come together and unanimously issue a statement, which started with the very important statement that local government management profession and ICMA were founded on a code of ethics and a declaration of ideals, which demand that we serve the best interest of all, achieve equity and social justice, and act with integrity so that we may earn the trust of all of those that we serve. That addressing systemic racism was our ethical obligation. And we developed 6 action steps that we would take as the leadership of ICMA. First, that we will engage our members and partners in a process of listening in the coming weeks with the purpose of understanding what our profession needs in order to deliver the work of our mission and vision through the lens of equity and inclusion. Second, that we will revisit the Code of Ethics to better integrate our ethical commitment to racial justice and equity in the very fiber of the 12 tenets. Third, that we will build ICMA's capacity with new knowledge, resources, training, and consulting to arm our members with the skills to drive the required changes in equitable governance. Fourth, that we will identify and support changes that increase transparency in public safety services and undertake an objective examination of professional policing. Fifth, that we will integrate equity and inclusion training into our global and regional events on a permanent basis. And then finally, that we as the executive board will engage in training to ensure that we do not bring our own biases to the work that we do for our members. As many of you have noted, ICMA has stepped up our efforts in regard to professional development opportunities at the ICMA conference, at regional conferences, through webinars, online content, and through programs such as this event and the event next week on Courageous Conversations, the LGBTQIA+ experience in local government. ICMA has teamed with the National Civic League and the Kettering Foundation and established a Leadership Institute on Race, Equity, and Inclusion with the first cohort of fellows going through the program this year. As the ICMA board continues to work on our 6 action steps and on our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts and social justice initiatives, we have come to recognize that this isn't easy work. The leadership of ICMA has been criticized from some members of ICMA, but the leadership of ICMA has become political, that we are intent on dividing our membership, and even as the ICMA leadership, that we are violating our own code of ethics. As a board, we will continue to stand up and take the position that work on DEI, social justice, and providing services to all of our members that they are seeking is not a political activity, but rather providing the tools our members need, as ICMA has always done. This work will continue to be hard, and the conversations will continue to be hard. But with many communities and with leaders such as yourselves, providing focus and putting forth a strong effort to confront systemic racism, I know that we will continue to make progress and that will help all of our members serve all of our residents, and that it will make our association stronger. Thank you and enjoy today's event.
Thank you, President Malloy, for the warm welcome and for kicking off our two-day event with your important leadership in support of our collective journey towards equity. I'm Latricia Tillman. I'm the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer for Washington County, Oregon. And we are Oregon's most diverse county and home of Nike and Intel, for those of you who aren't familiar with Oregon. As a member of ICMA's Equity Officer cohort, I am excited to introduce our first keynote. Troy Brown, City Manager of Moorpark, California, is an experienced city manager with more than 25 years of public service sector experience, positively impacting organizations through his dedication to enhance transparency, strategic planning, and fiscal acumen. He elevates the professionalism of local government through continuous community engagement, improving public infrastructure, and enhancing the quality of life for residents in the communities he serves. He is an ICMA member whose career path includes serving as an assistant to the city manager, an ICMA West Coast Regional Vice President, and as director of the Vantage Trust Company. Please welcome ICMA President-elect Troy Brown.
Well, thank you. And good morning, everyone, wherever you are. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm in beautiful downtown Moorpark, California, which is just west of Los Angeles. So it's definitely in the morning here. I want to welcome you and thank you all for coming. I know it is not easy to sit in front of a computer and attend a conference, but I appreciate those of you that are here and taking the time out to do this. I would much rather be with you in person, and I promise that I'll do my best to keep you engaged today. But if you start to feel a little drowsy or you want to stretch around, please feel free to get up and stretch your legs or turn on a filter and make me look like a cat or something. I have no inhibitions there, so have yourself at it. I also want to thank ICMA President Jim Malloy, and thank you, Latricia, for the very kind introduction. I had the honor to first meet Jim while I was working with Tansy Hayward, who's the Assistant City Manager from Raleigh, North Carolina. We worked together on ICMA's task force on strengthening inclusiveness in the profession back in 2015. And Jim was on the ICMA board at the time, and he was the board liaison to that task force. And I'll tell you, he is a courageous leader. I've seen Jim in action as the board president over the past year, and just what an amazing individual he is. He's a strong leader, he's a kind man, very decisive, and I've enjoyed the relationship with Jim that we've built over the years. I applaud the efforts that we're all doing in building better communities. Because you're present here today, that means that you're committed to the work that you're doing. And that's important because we're all sort of in this together and advancing our communities. This is important work. Building communities is the core of what local government professionals do. We have to recognize that it's certainly becoming more and more challenging every day. But building communities transcends the physical work that we do. As public employees, we have to build good citizens. Our profession demands it. And that means that we have to look deeply within ourselves and challenge ourselves to be good people, to care for one another. I used to work with a fire chief up in Northern California. And one of the key takeaways that I had from him was, we always have to take care of one another. We would have our department head meetings, and at the end of it, he would always end it with that: take care of one another. And that means we have to look deeply within ourselves and challenge ourselves to be good people. And I believe that's one of the keys to my success, is that I deeply care about people, because that's what makes the world a better place. That's how we rid ourselves of the things that seek to divide us. And ICMA cares deeply about that too. And I'm going to talk a little about some things the association's doing to help us on that journey. And I'm also going to talk about some of the influences in my life that I've experienced that have shaped my beliefs and my own ideologies. So if you take away nothing from what you hear today, either through me or through just a number of fantastic sessions that we have lined up for today, take away something for yourself. Think about how can you be a better person and build better residents and better citizens in the world. The Romans knew this, and beyond the technological advances that they made for their societies, there were philosophers that would stand in the center of cities and teach people how to think about themselves, how to think about the world, and how to make it a better place. And it was those interactions between those societies and the interactions between people that made them such a successful community. And it really was sort of the starting place for modern cities. All right, so let's go. I love this profession. I've learned and I've grown significantly throughout the course of my career. And honestly, for years, I didn't see the correlation between my work as a city employee and equity and inclusion. Maybe it was because I was too busy doing the day-to-day stuff that required, me to get to be successful in my positions. Maybe I was too busy working through the variety of tasks as a technician, working on filling potholes, responding to citizens' requests for information, designing and building parks, doing union negotiations. But community buildings has expanded my reach. And as I've progressed through my career and I've gotten a broader sort of perspective on the world that we live in and my reach on communities, I've learned about the correlation between the two. And I'll tell you, the issues of race and equality has been a journey for me. And I would venture that it's probably been a journey for all of us. None of us asked for this to be an issue. We're all born sort of genetically and physically the same, but we have cultural differences and we have appearance differences that stand out from the genetics that we have. And sometimes, even though that we're bound together by our DNA and by our genetic makeup, it's those cultural and those physical things that you can see that divide us. So for me, my journey of race and equality started back in the 60s. Now I'm going to date myself here, but it started back in the 60s in West Philadelphia, where I was born, on the heels of the death of some iconic civil rights activists like John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Now, clearly, John Kennedy was a president, and he wasn't sort of an activist, but he was clearly a man who fought for equality for all. And back in the 60s, there was a tremendous sense of loss that I felt, even as a child, that I really didn't fully comprehend. Everyone I knew, I would go around to my friends' places, my friends' houses or my relatives' houses, and I would go into their homes and I'd see photographs of Martin Luther King and John Kennedy. They were very prominent. And through the eyes of a child, I knew they were significant people, but I didn't understand at the time or had no particular context for their significance. But these are men who made progress on equal rights. Although they're often recognized for their work for Black people, their plight really was to seek equality for all people. Back in the 60s, Philadelphia was sort of ethnically divided into these little enclaves. There were Blacks primarily in West Philadelphia, where I lived. There were Italian Americans in South Philly. The Chinese immigrants were taking hold in the center of the city. I haven't been to Philly in quite a while, but I would venture that my city of brotherly love has certainly changed quite a bit over the years. It was a fantastic experience growing up there, and I wouldn't change it for the world. It was a very urbanized environment. We lived over a dry cleaner that my grandparents started back in the 1940s with their bare hands. You know, today it was probably be likened to one of the first mixed-use developments, you know, of West Philly. They had a dry cleaner on the bottom and then 2 apartments on the top. So we definitely lived and worked in the same place. Philadelphia was a concrete city, you know, by all measures, at least West Philly was. I remember going outside, and there's a school around the corner where I'd go out and I would play wall ball, you know, or stick ball, and hang out with my friends there. And it was just fantastic. There was a lot of dogs and a lot of alleys. I remember that growing up as a young kid. But that was all I knew. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time in West Philly. One of the earliest memories I have that stick out in my mind the most was just the availability of public transit. There was a trolley that ran east and west through West Philadelphia, and it took you downtown. And once you got on that trolley, and it was relatively cheap. I remember it being 15 cents or the cost of, I think it was the cost of an Almond Joy. So you would get on it and it would take you downtown, and you could connect to the L, or you could connect to a bus system. And it was really super reliable. I don't remember standing on the curb for more than, 10 or 15 minutes with the frequency of these trolleys running. So I always felt like I could get around. And my parents used to take me on that quite a bit. Now, I didn't know because, I was a child, and I didn't know if that was because it was the form of transportation that everyone used, or if it was, that was all that we could afford. But I did notice that when I would get on the trolley, I would look around and I would see people that looked just like me. I mean, it was a lot of African Americans, a lot of Blacks. And then when I got off in Center City, it was a little bit more diverse. It didn't really register in my head at the time, but I was seeing sort of the divergence of cultures there. From a sort of a fun perspective, we had a regional park. It was Fairmount Park. And I liken it sort of to Central Park. It wasn't as centralized as Central Park is in New York, but it was a sprawling park, and you could go there and literally roll down the hill. I remember rolling down the hill and getting up and itching because it had grass all over me. Or you could go horseback riding through Fairmount Park. There were cars that would come out, and people would just be everywhere on Sunday afternoon. Yes, Will Smith was in my neighborhood. He used to have these outrageous house parties when I was about 14 or 15 years old. I never went to them, but truth be told, Jazzy Jeff, who is Will's DJ, was more known than Will was at the time. Jazzy Jeff was just such a talented guy. And Philadelphia just felt like home to me. And I knew it at the time, but there were some issues that were sort of happening on the peripherals. And as a child, you really shouldn't have to worry about these things. Like I said, I cared about wall ball. I cared about going to the park. But there were lots of social movements that were sort of converging on one another at the same time. The National Organization of Women was really sort of starting to gain speed. I think it was founded in the late 60s. And there were a lot of people walking around with these now badges. And there were a lot of movements from Black activists that were offshoots from the Black Panthers and leftover feelings from the death of Dr. King, and anti-violence movements that were still very much a fabric of the society in certain sectors of the world. Unfortunately, we were still reeling from the trappings of violence as well. In the 1960s, following decades of racial, economic, and political forces, which generated a lot of inner city poverty, there were race riots that were happening in minority cities all across the United States. The beating, I remember the beating and rumored death of a cab driver by the name of John Smith by police. It was around 1968 or 69. It sparked the Newark riots. And then rioting began spreading across the United States and most major cities. There were a lot of deaths that were reported. And I remember as a very young child watching cities burn on the news. Many inner cities, just like the city that I lived in, were being destroyed. And then later in 1968, the assassination of Dr. King in Memphis, and then the June assassination of Robert F. Kennedy in Los Angeles led to nationwide rioting and similar mass deaths. And during that same time period, there were violent acts committed against Black churches and their members. And it was really pretty commonplace. And it was right around the corner from where I lived. And there were acts of violence between Blacks. There was a group called MOVE, and it wasn't an acronym for anything, it was MOVE. And they were a group that were separatists. And they believed that in order for Blacks to claim, their place in society, that we needed to be alone as people. And MOVE members were about 2 or 3 blocks from my house. And they carried machine guns and automatic weapons openly in public. And I didn't walk around that corner. You can imagine a 5 or 6 year old kid, walking around a corner and seeing someone standing on a porch with an automatic weapon. It leaves an indelible mark in my memory. You did not mess with them. I tried to avoid them at all costs because they would sort of shake me down. I'd walk over there and they'd want me to become a part of their movement. I didn't understand it, didn't want to be a part of it. But at the time, there was a mayor in Philadelphia, Mayor Frank Rizzo. He was an Italian guy, really well liked. I mean, up until some instances I'm going to describe to you. I mean, clearly well liked because he was elected mayor. The MOVE members were divisive, and they didn't send their kids to school, and they ran into trouble with the law, and it was all over the news. And Frank Rizzo sent in the police department one day to sort of deal with them because the community, even the Black community, was like, hey, this isn't working. So Frank Rizzo sent in a helicopter that had a little incendiary device on top of it and dropped it on top of one of the homes. And even though we lived in a mixed-use project, there was a lot of row homes in Philadelphia that were connected. And this incendiary device burned that house, the main house that the MOVE members were in. There's probably a whole backstory in terms of why that happened and a specific event that sparked him doing that. But I remember thinking as a kid, hey, yeah, go get him, Frank. This is a problem here. But when the fire department showed up, the mayor came out and said, nope, don't go in. And literally there was 2 square blocks that burned down. And a lot of people died. And I didn't understand that. And the community sort of came out and said, hey, this isn't what we intended to do. But I certainly didn't grasp the magnitude of what was going on. And eventually Frank Rizzo was obviously not reelected. I just wanted to go fishing, right? My grandparents lived out in the suburbs of southeastern Pennsylvania. And then my parents divorced when I was 5 or 6 years old. So we moved out there to the suburbs, and it was like living in a Hansel Adams painting. I mean, Downingtown was beautiful. We lived at the bottom of this field. And at the top side of the field, there were orchards and railroad tracks and forest. And there was the Brandywine Creek that ran through it. And there's a lot of history behind the Brandywine Creek, dating back to the times of the Civil War and Chad's Ford and all of that. And then there was a creek that ran through our property down into the Brandywine Creek. And if you don't know what a creek is, you should talk to somebody on the East Coast. I'm sure that they can fill you in, but it's basically a stream or a tributary, but we called it a creek back then. And I would go out and, go into the creek and pick up crayfish and go hunting for salamanders, all this stuff that you're supposed to do when you're a kid. One of the things that I noticed is that there were certainly more whites in the suburbs than I saw in West Philly. And from my perspective, we were all really equal. And as a child, you shouldn't have to worry about those things. I wanted to go to the park and play on the monkey bars. And I absolutely loved the suburbs. I remember getting jars of lightning bugs and putting all the lightning bugs into a little jar, taking them back to my room at night and having them flash. It was my own little nightlight. And then I'd wake up the next morning and they'd all be dead. So I had to figure it out. So I'd go out the next day and I'd gather up all these lightning bugs and I'd put them in a jar and poke holes in the top of the mason jar and put some grass in there, throw some grasshoppers in there because lightning bugs obviously go with grasshoppers. As a child, you don't understand this stuff. And then all the lightning bugs would fly out at night. They'd be flying all over my room. That's the kind of thing that a child should experience. That's the kind of childhood that I would think that most people would want to have. Going on walks into the orchards and picking berries and picking peaches and picking apples and eating them until you can't eat anymore and going back home and checking yourself for ticks. I got quite proficient at checking myself for ticks. Those little buggers can get into the cracks of your elbows. They can get behind your ears. But those are the things that children should be worried about. That, in many regards, is community building. Those are the memories that we get to create. And I remember having conversations, back in the early part of my career, and someone asked me, what was it about my job that I liked? And it was the fact that I get to create these memories of people's childhood, of going out and playing football and playing hide and go seek. And if there's one thing I remember from my childhood, it's when the streetlights came on, I had to be home. So I had a typical childhood, but then something happened. As I got older, around the age of 10 or 12, and I became more informed. I won't say that I became educated, but I became more informed and aware about race. And I noticed that I wasn't welcomed everywhere in the suburbs. Some of my friends wouldn't have me over at their house. I couldn't go to certain places or certain parties by myself. People looked at me differently, almost like I had done something. So I was a very, very inquisitive child. And I would talk to my grandfather and I would talk to my mother about the questions about, why are people looking at me like this? Why is it that I can't go anywhere? And my grandfather, I wouldn't go as far as to say that he was a MOVE member separatist, but my grandfather very much believed in separatism among Blacks. And he believed and he invested heavily in the Black community. He would take us shopping on the way home from work, and we would have to stop at Black-owned businesses, which, by the way, at the time was not convenient and certainly did not have the inventory that some of the chain stores had. But he invested his time, his treasure, and he worked in the Black community. So he told me then that there were segments of people that didn't want us to be successful and that we as Black people had to help each other out. And I remember, being very thoughtful about that. You know, what about my friends? What about my friends that aren't Black? Who's going to help them out? My mother was heavily dependent and influenced by her father after the divorce. You know, we lived in his house, so she listened to him and was influenced a lot by what he said. So I would ask her some of the same questions, and she would sit me down like a good mom. She would try to talk to me on levels where I could understand it, and I was really comfortable asking my mom questions. I've always asked a lot of questions in my life, and I asked her once when I was in Philadelphia if women turned white when they got old, because I really hadn't seen a lot of older Black women. I mean, you know, to see the world through the eyes of a child, you know, unencumbered in that regard. But she took those questions. She never made me feel silly. She would answer the questions, and you know, those conversations though began to shape my opinions little by little over time. And there was never a moment that was the flash moment that sort of changed everything in my life. But over time, I was taught about racism in the country. And some of it that I learned, you know, as I now look back and reflect on it, some of what I learned was true. But some of what I learned was the objective opinion or subjective opinion filtered through the eyes of other people. And I'll tell you that I look back on that, and I don't think that there was any malice or any ill will intent there. You know, there were people that were actually thought that they were helping, and they thought that they were doing the right thing to try and shape my mind to understand what was going on. I just wanted to be better. I just wanted to live. You know, I just wanted to have the same opportunities that other people had. And I didn't think, you know, even as a child, that was a lot to ask for. And I didn't play by the rules. I had white friends. I had Black friends. I had Polish friends. I had Italian. I had Asian. I had Puerto Rican friends. But I couldn't escape the differences in our lives. Living in the suburbs to me was great. I felt free from the tension of the city. And by the time I got to high school, I was getting educated about race. Well, I guess to the extent that the public school system can educate you. And there's a whole nother session on that. So I'm not going to go there. But I began to realize sort of what's important. And what's important is every single day. You know, every day, every moment on this planet, and spending it doing the things that make me a better person, regardless of that, irrespective of all the things that's going on. That's what's important for me. And in my hometown, back in southeastern Pennsylvania, the Blacks were congregated into a small part of that city. It was a great part of the city, but there was a paper mill there. And then there was a factory that made cookies and donuts, and Pepperidge Farm, you used to go there. And there were generations of African Americans that worked at that plant. And if you were lucky enough to get a job there, you could live a decent lifestyle in that small town. I always felt like there's just more to the world than that. So when I was in high school, I was not the best student. There was one time in 7th grade where I missed 110 out of 180 days of school. And surprise, surprise, I was retained in 7th grade. I got better the next year in 8th grade, and I missed only about 90 out of 180 days of school. So they held me back in 8th grade and then gave me a social promotion, and I was in 9th grade. And I had a counselor that came up to me and said, "Troy, what are you doing? You know, you're 2 years behind. Your sister's going to catch you in school now. Your testing is off the charts. You test fine. We need you to get to school." And there was a lot of reasons why I wasn't going. A lot of it had to do with mental health issues with my parents, and I won't go into all that. But this counselor saved my life. This counselor said, "You know, you have to get engaged in school. It has to be something that brings you joy. And I ended up running for class president in ninth grade. And I was class president in ninth grade, and I think I missed 17 days of school. I was class president in 10th grade. I think I missed 10 days of school. And so the story goes on. But I felt like I never really had the resources to be able to do the things that I saw a lot of my white friends doing. You know, a lot of them were going to be going to Penn State or going to NYU. And they had these sort of grandiose plans figured out for their lives. And I didn't know what I wanted to do when I got out of school. Although I do know this, I wanted to get out of school. That was the only thing that I wanted to do. And my dad had remarried a few years before, and his wife was associate dean of students. She got a job as associate dean of students at UCLA. So during my senior year, I came out to Los Angeles to visit them. And I remember getting off the plane in LA, December 23rd, 1986. And I walked outside and it was 83 degrees. And I said, you know, I think I know what I want to do when I get out of school. And I'll tell you, I have not shoveled snow since. But coming to California was very different than being on the East Coast. You know, walking into the San Fernando Valley, it was very much a melting pot. There weren't these enclaves of people. We had sort of a collision of people that were living together. It was really fascinating to me. And I embraced that because I had always hung out with all different types of people anyway. But I thought, you know, for all intents and purposes, that, you know, when I got to Los Angeles, I was going to work for UPS, and that was going to be my career, which was clearly a step up from working at the paper mill back in southeastern Pennsylvania. So I got my job at United Parcel Service, but it was at night, and I worked from 6 o'clock until about 9 o'clock every night, and that gave me the opportunity to hold a variety of day jobs. And I used to valet park cars on Beverly Hills. It was phenomenal. I got to meet some of the you know, the big stars of the world. And you know, as a young adolescent, that was, you know, here I am in LA meeting Mike Tyson. Woohoo! It was fantastic. But that didn't last. And one day I picked up the newspaper and I saw a job as a recreation leader. I didn't even know what a recreation leader was, but it was customer service. And I've always enjoyed helping people. So I applied for this job, and it was a recreation leader for a city here in Southern California. And I was the guy that if you were going to have a birthday party or if you were going to have a special event at the park, you would call me and I'd reserve the park for you. And the city was brand new. It had incorporated in 1987. And I think I started in 1989 or 90. So, you know, we were bringing parks online. We were building trails. People were moving into the city and they were reserving all these parks. So I really, really enjoyed it. And I remember one of the first tasks that I had was to do a parade, reserve a parade in the right of way to have a celebratory parade for one of the officers that was acquitted in the Rodney King trial. So I remember going to my boss and saying, hey, you know, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't feel super good about this. And he sat me down and listened intently and very intently and said, you know, you sort of got to treat everyone the same here. And it's not a political issue at all. Go out and do it. If you have any problems with it, that's a different story. We'll have an issue with that. But, you know, he gave me a different perspective on the role of government. And I did it, and it turned out great. I had the opportunity to really experience a lot of different things because that organization was built on creativity. That organization was built on innovation. And the city manager didn't care if you were white, black, yellow, or brown, you had to perform. And I absolutely loved it. Funny thing is, the Parks and Recreation budget at the time was the largest expenditure budget within the organization. I don't believe it's that way today, but he believed that if you invest on the front side of people, then you won't invest as much on the back side of people. I've tried to emulate that thinking as I've grown throughout my career, but it's a real challenge today, given a lot of different factors. But I learned a lot, and I went to apply to be a position later. I forget, it might have been a code enforcement officer or something. And my department had sat me down and said, "No, you're not gonna get this job unless you go back to school." So I actually ended up going back to school and getting my degree, and then starting to progress through the organization. And as I progressed in my career in local government, at first I thought, this is just a job. This is just a means for me to get a paycheck. But it became more than that very quickly. It became a calling for me, and providing people the opportunities and for the experience that I had growing up. I wanted people to be able to not worry about the things that were going on in the world, but to go out and catch fireflies, to go out and catch salamanders and walk trails and build those memories. And I was, I learned by this point in my life, I knew that everyone didn't have the opportunities that I had. So over time, I ended up leaving that organization. As city manager, went to a larger organization out, toward the desert here. And moving to a full-size organization, we offered police, fire, utilities, water, airport, golf course, everything. It was a very different experience. The neighborhoods there were sort of set up in some of the enclaves that I had seen growing up. For example, the older neighborhoods, the residents there, right? They wanted to have the same infrastructure that they saw going in other parts of town, because we were doing new developments on sort of the outskirts of the city. And then in the core, you would have some of the more socioeconomic and some of the more diverse people, saying, when are we going to get the level of services that you're seeing there? I remember that we had an incident once where we ran a softball league, and there was a gang shooting at the park. And I remember the parks director sitting down with me and the city manager and the assistant city manager. I was the assistant too at the time. And he was saying, that's it. And actually the police chief was there. He was saying, that's it. We have to move our league. We have to cancel our league. We can't have people going out there and getting shot. And gang violence was really plaguing the streets. And one of the conversations that we had that was different, a difficult conversation was no, we're not moving our leagues. We're going to program that park. We're going to put people in that park, because we believe that gang violence will be pushed away by goodness. We believe in good over evil. And we did that. We did delay the games for a couple of weeks, but we started programming in recreational programming, Frisbee games, yoga classes, outdoors in the park. And the gangs sort of, they started to go out in the peripheries. Ultimately, I didn't stay at that city, and I ended up going up north to Northern California. And that really changed my view of the world and of the work that I do. Working in the Bay Area and around the Bay Area was very different than working in Southern California. It's almost like two different states. By now I was really starting to progress through my career path, and I became an assistant city manager. So one of the things I had to do was downsize that organization because of the housing crisis. And I thought about the impact of the housing crisis on people, and was it affecting different portions and different segments of the population differently, which really sort of sparked some thoughts in my head about how we view people and how we treat people and the level of services that we provide for people. We had to navigate that very difficultly, and we had to think about innately, what we would do to support those communities that didn't have the resources that other communities had, because we were losing homes in ethnic enclaves of the city. And that was the moment in time, if there was ever a moment in time, where the connection between my work and equity was becoming abundantly clear. It's important because I care deeply about people. And even though every one of the cities that I've worked in was different, geographically, demographically, economically, all those people wanted, by and large, the same thing. They just wanted to be given a chance to have the memories that we grew up with. They were all saying things like, we need more police, or we need more parks, or mind my taxes. But if you sort of weave through all of that and peel back all the layers of the onion, what you're really hearing people say is just give me a chance. Give me a chance to have a good quality of life here. And so, like I said, I didn't think that I was dealing with issues of equity and inclusion, so I thought, but I was creating these spaces on the grandest scales of people to self-actualize, realizing that I actually had a hand, and this was just an incredible feeling. And I wanted more of it. The more I did it, the more I wanted to do it. It was sort of like my own little drug there. I want more and more. I want to be able to impact this community. I want to be able to impact that community. I wanted to do it on a bigger scale. And I began learning about the role and the significance of cities. So being in California, we respond to a myriad of disasters that upend the lives of residents. They come out of nowhere, and it can change the perspective and the priority of a community overnight. After my first disaster, I think it was a fire, I hearkened back to the riots of my youth and thought, wow, where do we go? How do we rebuild? Where do we go from here? And in every disaster, there are these untold stories of these local government heroes that play a role in community building. And their stories are significant because we are at the front and center of the recovery efforts of disasters. And equity and inclusion could be a disaster in your community. And we have to be at the front and center of that conversation. So I'm sure most of you probably remember the Katrina floods or the Northridge earthquake, or back in 2010 or 2011, sometime around there. There was these super outbreaks of tornadoes in the Midwest and in Virginia. And then the Deepwater Horizon event of 2010. All of those events were tragic, and it required interagency coordination. Interagency coordination is not just a word. It's public officials working together to rebuild communities so kids can go back and play in the monkey bars, so they can get dirty on baseball fields, or they can play jump ropes in the streets. And what we don't hear from all of those disasters are the heroes in the local government that played a part in moving their communities forward in the wake of that unrest. And if you look at, go back to the Watts riots, or you go back to the Newark riots, or back to all those race riots, those cities rebuilt. And sure, there were community leaders, and there were people that were instrumental in stopping that violence, but front and center in that conversation are local public officials, not only doing the hard work of rebuilding communities, but rebuilding their residents, providing them with those opportunities to self-actualize. So somewhere, and we can never lose sight of this, somewhere in every one of our cities, and I would argue that that's you, there are local officials that will need to repair the physical state of our communities following all sorts of disasters. So, I'm used to following a disaster. I'm used to rebuilding a road. That's easy. It's easy and it's tangible. You can see it. That road was broken. I've appropriated money. I've put together the resources. I've rebuilt the road. I've cut the ribbon on the road. That's a very tangible thing that you can see that happens. In floods, we drain water, or we work with Mother Nature to help her drain water and protect to the extent that we can public safety and the health and well-being of our residents. We recover from wildfires. We put in building codes to make us more resilient over time. And we even clean up after parades. It's not always a natural disaster. We will clean up after a ticker tape parade. That hasn't happened for a long time for the Dallas Cowboys. That's a whole nother story. And you will hear over the next year that I'm a huge Dallas Cowboy fan. But we do restore services and repair our cities following civil unrest. And we ensure the health and safety of our residents in the community and give them a chance to succeed in their lives and a chance for their children to succeed in our lives. And the issue of equity and inclusion is no different. We may not have that physical ribbon that we're going to cut, or we may not have that trash that we'll pick up off the street, but rebuilding our communities after they've gone through periods of inequity, or after they've gone through periods of strife, is just as important and just as noble and just as part of our role as disaster recoveries. Cities, they rise from the ashes, but they don't rise from the ashes by themselves. They rise from the ashes on the shoulders of professional managers committed to a set of values, to provide people the opportunities to self-actualize. And we don't care if it's the Puerto Ricans or the Latinos or the Blacks or the whites. We have to do that. And I'll recognize it. I mean, my staff, sometimes I have a good team, and my team, we all don't think alike. So in perfect world scenario, I like to run around my organization sprinkling pixie dust all over the place. Everything's going to be great. Everything's going to be fine. And my staff somehow has the opportunity to bring me back to earth sometimes to say, sometimes things just don't work out that way, Troy. And that's how we develop good policy. And I need that from my team. So I don't want to sit here and propose that if we provide an opportunity that everyone is going to self-actualize. Some people don't, and some people can't. But by and large, many of them do. And I tell people that ICMA teaches me things that I didn't learn in my MPA program, right? So for example, I went to, when I was doing my MPA program, I took a class on budgeting. And I learned all about public budgeting and how that plays into the bigger policy discussion. I learned a lot about political structure. I learned, about different forms of government, how legislation works, policy making. But one thing that I didn't learn that ICMA has taught me is how to tactfully say no to a council member, how to garner real resident input and collaborate with residents and stakeholders to solve problems. That really is the purpose of ICMA. We were founded on a code of ethics and a declaration of ideals that demand that we serve the best interest of all of our residents to achieve equity and social justice. And I would say that has to start with you. We have to build better citizens. We have to build better residents, and we have to be better officials. My job, I'm here from 8 until something every day. And then when I leave, I go home and I'm a part of my community, right? And what does that mean? Now, it didn't happen in this community, and I was much younger, and I've become much wiser since the 1960s. But I recall one time I was sitting at an intersection in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is a fairly big city with fairly big streets. Certainly not like my little small town in southeastern Pennsylvania. You hit the walk button, and I've seen signals count down from 45. I mean, you have to cross 4 lanes of directional traffic in each way. So it's a long way. I remember once I was sitting, watching someone walk across the street, and I looked, and the guy had long hair, decked out in just leather, tattoos sort of everywhere. There was a chain that went from his ear down into his pocket. And he was wearing these boots with these jeans. And I thought to myself, I don't feel comfortable there. And as he walked in front of my car and walked past me, the back of his jacket said, "Don't judge." And I thought to myself, there you go. That's me. That's on me. I need to be better. Because I looked and I judged, and I shouldn't have. I don't know anything about this person. But that's what ICMA is teaching me. ICMA is teaching me how I can be a better person, how I can be a better individual, and how I can be how I can be the best person that I can be. Because citizens are made up of people. And yeah, we can fix infrastructure all day long. Yeah, we can rebuild communities all day long, but we have to build better people. And the way you do that is you provide opportunities for everyone in your community. President Malloy mentioned earlier, and I think it's worth reaffirming, that following the death of George Floyd, ICMA as an organization and association came out, issued a statement denouncing police brutality and reaffirming its commitment to advancing equity in communities. And the association has taken specific steps on equity and inclusion. And in fact, this summit today is an offshoot of the progress and the steps that ICMA is taking to allow people and to provide opportunities for people to self-actualize. So what specifically is ICMA doing? We are engaging our members and partner affiliates for the purpose of understanding what does the profession need in order to deliver on the work of the mission of ICMA to provide equity and inclusivity through that lens. What more do we need to do? As President Malloy mentioned, we're going through an effort to revisit the code of ethics to better integrate our commitment to racial justice and equality into the very fiber of those tenets. We are building our capacity with new knowledge resources, with new training, with new consulting, to arm our members and to arm each of you with the skills and the drive to build a more equitable governance structure. ICMA is identifying and supporting changes that increase transparency in public safety services and undertaking an objective examination of professional policing. ICMA is integrating equity and inclusion into training and into our global and our regional efforts on a permanent basis. And again, this summit is an offshoot of that effort. Just this year, the executive board engaged in a training to ensure that we don't bring our own biases to the work and to the members. Our members have asked us to do this, and we've gone through that training, and it's phenomenal. It's a continual learning, and I even learned throughout that process. But there's focus being put in this area, not because it's our mission, but it's because it's just the right thing to do. It's the right thing that we should be doing as professional managers. So it really is, it's important that you're here today. I hope, and I'm sure that you're going to learn about tools to address issues of equity and inclusion, which is no different than any other disaster in your community. Anything that stands to undermine the ability of residents to self-actualize is a threat to your community. And you will be called upon to address it. You know, that's the thing that you don't see on the news. You know, what you see on the news is you see people marching down the streets or gathering for peace or for whatever cause. It could be equity, it could be taxes, it could be traffic, but you see people marching down the streets. That's what makes the news. What doesn't make the news are the local government professionals that are bringing these people together, engaging in conversations with them to help build resiliency and help people self-actualize. A community that embraces an equitable culture within your own city. That's what you don't see. And that's the untold work of what it is that we do every single day. And if you come at it from the perspective of you want someone to have the same opportunities that you have, then the job becomes easy. You know, the job becomes really, really easy for me. Because who knows, you know, where that kid is in your community that's going to be the next city manager. You know, who knows where that kid is in your community that's going to be the next director or the next big person or the next economic development or the next astronaut coming out of your community. But also, who knows who knows where that person is in your community that may be hearing a different message and that's shaping their values over time, right? So I try to just tell people how it is, listen to their input, and provide them with information to help them make their own decisions. Because everyone else is doing it. You know, everyone else is doing it. And it happened to me when I was growing up, and there was no ill will on my grandparents' part, on my mother's part, but they were shaping a little bit of what was happening with me. So ICMA is here to help. For those of you that were thrust into this role, you know, I'm sorry. it's really difficult. That's not what you signed up for. ICMA has already initiated some steps, and ICMA can help your chief equity officers with the tools they need to continue to make the progress on this most important issue. I'm glad that you're here today. But more important to that, I need you to commit to some action. So we're not going to fix this today. You know, we're not going to fix this this issue of equality and inclusion even this week. We're not going to fix it this year, but we can make continued progress, and we can move the needle to make sure tomorrow is better than today. And in order to do that, I encourage you to take what you learned, and even if it's just one thing, but take what you learned back to your organization. If you're a city or a county executive, the best thing that you can do is that you can support the people that are implementing programs in your community. Challenge them to show how they plan to move the needle, but they can't do it alone. You know, they have to be in a culture where addressing equity and inclusion is embraced. They're going to make mistakes. We all are, but let's give each other some deference to make those mistakes, to fail forward, and to move the needle. We can learn from each other, and we can make incremental progress on this issue. And I think most people want the same things that I wanted as a child. You know, they want to play baseball. They want to fish in a creek. You know, there's my East Coast coming out again. Again, if you don't know what a creek is, that's someone from the East Coast. But they want to have the opportunity to be the best person that they can be. And although it seems like it should be a simple thing, there really is work that we can do to try and give everyone an equal shot at that. You never know where your life is going to take you. I certainly didn't expect to be the president-elect of ICMA, but look what can happen when you're just given a chance, right? If it worked out for me, the least I can do is to create pathways for where it could happen to others, regardless of their gender status, regardless of their race, regardless of their creed, regardless of their sexual orientation. So it's not a lot to ask for us to be, you know, decent human beings. I know we will never reach every person, and I know that not everyone's going to self-actualize in the same way. And some people need help, and others are provided with resources that other people don't have. And I'm okay with that. But the cool thing about our profession, and the cool thing about what we do, is we can play a small part in that. And I'm not suggesting that we all get involved in forcing people to have the same outcome. What I am saying is, let's remove the barriers that hinder people's abilities to be the best that they can be. And ICMA is committed to these ideals. It was founded on it, and we're here to help. And that's the work that began years ago and continues today. And President Malloy has championed this over the past year, and I'm committed to working with him and the board over the next year and advancing our work in community building and building resident capacity and strengthening this capacity and strengthening this profession that we hold so dear. So I don't know if that's 46 minutes, or I don't know if you guys have a break now, but in closing, I really want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you for hearing my story. And like I said, we're not going to fix this overnight, but we have to get started. We have a lot of work to do to move the needle, even if we move the needle only a bit. So given that there's a lot of work to do, let's get to it. Let's get to work. Thank you for being here. Thank you to ICMA staff. Thank you for each of you for the work that you're doing in your community and the little bit of progress that you're making each day. I believe that progress over time will be pivotal in creating a better world for all of us. So enjoy the summit. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much, Troy, for those powerful, inspirational words. On behalf of myself, ICMA's first equity leadership cohort, and everyone listening this morning, I want to offer appreciation again. First, Jim, for your warm welcome, your leadership, and for communicating ICMA's commitment to equity. And Troy, for sharing your personal story, reflecting on your journey and about how you have come to discover the correlation between your work and equity. Reflecting on West Philadelphia, where you were born and raised, and on the playground where you spent most of your days. You talked about playing wall ball, not b-ball, and you might not have ended up in Bel Air, but your journey offered you space to enjoy childhood in the suburbs in Southeast Pennsylvania and California. The things that you shared about your childhood life resonate with many of us. We have cricks and crawfish out here in Oregon too, but not lightning bugs. And more seriously, sharing about the magnitude of the political context in which you grew up in the 60s and beyond, as well as how you came to understand racial dynamics in your community and how your counselor saved your life. And many of us can identify with that critical counselor, friend, or mentor who helped us make an important pivot in our lives. And many of us also know people whose potential was never realized because they didn't have access to that important person. Sounds like your experience and your understanding that different communities are structured with different opportunities helped you to see and be sensitive to inequities as they play out in access to safety, recreation, and a good quality of life and healthy housing. And thank you for noting that the strength of our relationships makes us better technicians and leaders. And as many of us are called in to step up to respond to major community events and disasters, whether responding to COVID, as many of us have been doing over the last year plus, and natural disasters and community level tragedies that galvanize and refocus us on the importance of social movements, like the murder of George Floyd. We're often called upon to respond and rebuild communities in which our families can thrive. Your comment that cities don't rise from the ashes by themselves reminds us that we're often pulled out of our technical and tangible roles into leadership where we have to stand on our values, particularly that of deep democracy that helps us serve all community members and residents. And thank you for reminding us that inequity and the failure of our society to allow people to fully self-actualize is a waste, a disaster, and a crisis. And we need to approach inequity with the same level of investment and attention as we have other crises. And that centers this commitment, as you mentioned, to a deep care about people, not just ourselves or our families, but as public servants, how can we be better residents, build better, stronger communities? So again, thank you. As we pivot toward the break, I want to mention to folks that in support of Pride Month, ICMA is hosting a couple of events to support us all in entering into deeper conversation, allyship, and understanding more deeply the needs of our LGBTQIA community members, brothers, sisters, friends, and family. I invite you to check that out on the ICMA site. And as we pivot towards the breakout sessions, I invite everyone to take a break, rest your eyeballs, stretch, and then return for the concurrent sessions that will begin at 1/4 the hour, and you'll be able to access them through the schedule tab. Thank you again for joining us this morning. Enjoy your break, and we look forward to seeing you in the breakout sessions this afternoon. Thank you.